Morning. How's everyone doing? Feels tired today in here, right? Me too, a little bit, right? It's Wednesday. Wednesday's always like that hard day of the week. I even had to think about it. I'm like, right? It's Wednesday. Yes, it's Wednesday. Uh, well, I have a couple of like cool videos that we'll watch today. So hopefully, and we'll have some discussion about that. So that'll kind of get us up and get us going. But we'll keep going with chapter two. We have a couple more models to go. And then our next chapter is assessment. And then after assessment, we finally get to the disorders. So we're getting closer and closer and closer. They're coming, right? If you're like, where are the disorders? They're coming. But what we'll do today is we'll start here with this humanistic model. We finished with cognitive and cognitive behavioral. And this model is really a little bit different than some of the other ones in the sense that it's very like positive. It includes some things like spirituality and goodness and growth and meaning in life. So let me write this one up here as well. So humanistic, existential. Now, this is actually two separate models, but they often combine them together. So we have the humanistic model and the existential model. Those sometimes are kind of addressed as like a cluster. So we'll talk about them together. But things we could say here like goodness and growth, self-awareness, and meaning. Right. So the humanistic model is something that came like after Freud, after behaviorism. And the idea behind humanism was to look at more like positive influences. Freud's theories are very like negative in the sense that he looked at a lot of darker things like aggression and like the driving forces of sexuality. So the humanistic model looks at like becoming self-aware, realizing our potential as a person, that everybody's like fundamentally good. It kind of looks at some of these more like positive elements of psychology. And it even kind of incorporates a little bit of like spirituality and bigger meaning in life. And the existential model is very much about meaning. What is it that drives you? What is it that pushes you? Where do you get your meaning and value in your life? So again, together they fit nicely, but they're sometimes talked about separately. So from the humanistic model, we get somebody named Carl Rogers as a big contributor. And Rogers is one of like the bigger names in terms of like therapists. Freud, obviously, we hear about all the time, but Carl Rogers developed a type of therapy that he called client-centered therapy. And the name kind of says it, right? He put the client at the center of the therapeutic process. He believed that the client should guide the way, that he didn't want to be too like influential in the process in terms of guiding the client. It was all about learning to kind of have acceptance and self-awareness. It's a very interesting type of therapy that people either tend to love or hate. And Rogers, as I said, really well-known guy in the therapy field. We don't have a lot of videos of a lot of these people that we're talking about, but we do have a video of Rogers. And there was this really cool little series that they did back in like the 50s, 60s, where they had a couple of different therapists, Rogers, and then this next one, Fritz Perls, that we're going to talk about, work with a woman named Gloria. So this woman came in and volunteered to basically have like a 30-minute session with three different therapists. And one of them is Rogers. And so what I have that I want to show you, the first clip is Rogers talking a little bit about how he believes in conducting therapy, some of his kind of big ideas. Kind of neat to see him talking about like his theories. And then we'll watch him spend a few minutes with Gloria. And I'm going to write a few terms to kind of summarize his approach on the board as he's talking. But a really cool opportunity to see him and then see how he would conduct therapy. You're being phony, right? Like, and just so different, right? And you can see he doesn't pay a lot of attention to the things that she says. He's focusing on every little thing that she does, her smiles, her squirming, where she puts her hand, all this kind of stuff. But it almost feels like he makes more progress in those few minutes than Rogers did. I don't know, it's kind of up for debate. What do you think? You like this? How many of you would like pearls if you had to go? I see a lot of, yeah? Yeah? What do you think? Why? Yeah. Sure. Okay. And sometimes people love that. Like some people really like this like direct, like, blunt kind of approach. Larry, let's see. If you had to pick one, forced choice, you have to either see Rogers or Pearls. How many of you would vote to see Rogers? He's looking better now, right? A few more of you. How many of you Pearls? I'm assuming the rest of you are not gonna decide, huh? So other thoughts on Pearls? Like what do you think? Yeah.
I can see it being effective. Also know that I personally, like, especially with like they're calling attention to little detail.
Yeah,
It would piss me off.
sure.
But then I'd also probably go home thinking, kind of help point.
Yeah.
And then I go to the next session, be pissed off.
But even more mad that he actually did have a point, but in
Right.
making you angry, right?
Right, I can see the value. It
Right.
would really irritate me.
Oh, totally. And some people, I mean, I can see getting really irritated like she does. I think I would shut down, like at some point, I would stop, like, I would just like freeze.
Yeah.
And I'd be like, fine, I'm not giving you anything, right? Like, I'm not gonna move at all. Good luck, right? And I can see people kind of going either way. Yeah,
You mentioned like the frustration and like
Yeah.
going home being like, oh, fuck, he was right. And come back the next day
Yeah.
and being,
yeah,
reminds me of Young a little bit. Young seems like a blended still.
yeah.
But I feel like Pearls, I feel like after a couple minutes, I'd be like, fuck, give me a cigarette. And like this, he seems like someone to be friends with.
Okay.
Like, because Rogers was very like kind of, it's interesting because Rogers was like more kind but distant.
Sure.
Whereas it feels like Pearls is more direct and blunt, but he's right there with you.
He is. He's very
So,
present with her.
Yeah, it seems very it seems more intimate.
Mhm. Yeah, and I feel like they like kind of get at some stuff too, like very quickly in that way. Yeah, did you have a thought?
Oh, yeah, I was gonna say like, I almost feel like, was it Gestalt?
Gestalt, yeah.
Gestalt is like, almost like too like on the nose, but then like Carl is too passive. I
Yeah,
kind of wish there was like a balance between both therapies.
totally. And there are
There
tons of people
yeah.
who like don't take
Mhm.
either approach, right? And they use some of those techniques, but they don't necessarily adhere to one rigid like category.
Yeah, I think that, taking elements from both and combining it
Yeah.
would probably be useful.
Oh, for sure, right? Because it's really important to notice the nonverbal stuff that your clients do, right? And there are a lot of techniques that do something called mirroring. So if a client crosses their arms, the therapist, in theory, from some perspectives, should cross their arms to put themselves in the physical space their client is in. If their client is fidgety, like that could indicate like anxiety or discomfort. But so you want to notice the nonverbal stuff. But the verbal stuff should matter too, right? Like you want that nice balance between the two. And we're looking at like purists who are taking it from like purely their own perspective. And thankfully, very few people are that way now. Like it's more that, people will be like, hey, I noticed you're like fidgeting. Are you okay? Or like, I feel like an energy shift in the room, paying attention to the nonverbals. But then also, doing some of these things as well, and along with other techniques, and then maybe also looking at dreams when they come up and kind of incorporating a little of everything. And I think the best therapists are the ones who are able to kind of pick and choose from that toolkit, depending on the person in front of them and what they have going on that day. But I wanted you to see just how different these different things can look. Gestalt therapy is very like hands-on. They do a lot of little activities in therapy, which are interesting. There's one called the empty chair technique. And it's literally like you have the client sitting in a chair and then you would have an empty chair in front of them. And in that empty chair, you visualize like a person. So let's say you have a client who, I had a client once, like, so as an example, who was dreading going home for Christmas to tell her parents that she had a girlfriend for the first time. Okay, so what we did is we did this empty chair technique. It's one of the few times I did it. And we had the empty chair be her mom, because she was most afraid of what her mom would say. Okay, so she sat in one chair and she talked to her mom, the imaginary empty chair mom. And then she had to get up and go sit in the chair as her mom and talk back with herself. And you literally get up between the two chairs right? And have this conversation. And it's like a very powerful, like perspective taking exercise. And then she went home and had the conversation and she's like, I knew what my mom was going to say because I had put myself in her spot and imagined it. Really cool, like activity to do. Yeah. Sure. Yeah.
It was like her favorite technique to use, and I hated it. Like,
Yeah.
I refused to do it.
You can definitely overuse it
It
too,
was
right?
so bad. And I know like other like friends in treatment that like really liked it and it really helped them, but I felt so embarrassed to do it.
Yeah. And a good therapist would like check in with you on that. You know, not to say that your therapist wasn't good, but like some people are incredibly uncomfortable doing stuff like that. You feel embarrassed. And sometimes it's worth pushing through that, and other times maybe not, right? So it's tricky. It can be helpful for some and uncomfortable for others. It is a little embarrassing in a way, right?
Made and like
Okay.
equal,
Mhm.
like divorce from them and like separate from them. Like there's this whole book, I think it's called like My Life Without Ed, and it's like about this woman who like names her eating disorder Ed, and then she like talks about how it was like a full-on like relationship or like a marriage, and she like had to learn how to like divorce him.
Uh-huh.
It was one of my favorite books when I was in treatment. but
Sure.
They always like implemented that into like the equity chair technique. So like they would have us like name our eating disorder. Mine was named Prudence. I don't know why. I just named the name.
Uh-huh.
And then we would have to like do like the back and forth thing. And I just could never do it. But
Yeah.
I know it was really
Yeah, and it can be, and for others, not so much. And you were talking about that, and it reminds me, there's a really popular approach right now called parts work. I don't know if any of you have heard of like IFS, internal family systems therapy, sometimes called ego states therapy, sometimes called parts work. And the idea is that we all are made up of different parts, right? And that different parts of you might feel differently about different things. And so you name and identify the parts of you, and one part might be like an eating disorder, or one part might be a childhood part that suffered trauma, or a part of you that's anxious versus a part of you that isn't, right? And that one's growing in popularity quite a bit right now, very common with trauma work. And it reminded me of that when you said that. But yeah, that you know, role-playing activity is very common in this perspective. Any other thoughts about these two? Anything else? Yeah.
Because if you really have a makes you feel like you can't hide it.
Yeah.
So what's the point of hiding it?
Right.
And where we might as well. So
Mhm.
I think that's why it's important for us. It seems like he doesn't get down on his patient.
Mhm.
And I feel like if you were to use the stop therapy, you would have to be someone who's comfortable, and humble, so that you don't look down on the patient.
Yeah.
And because if you're being blunt, completely, you're looking down on the patient, and that's gonna lead into the mistake of them.
Sure.
And then even they feel like they can't hide anything from you, now it's a hostage again.
Mhm. Yeah.
So they're gonna shut down. But I think Pearls does a good job of being humble
Mhm.
and maybe so Gloria, right?
Gloria, yeah.
Can't hide it, and so it's the point of eating.
Yeah, right. And you know, it's interesting because in a way she was being very phony. You know, she had a front that she put up and he didn't let that stand at all, right? So I do appreciate like that about him. I don't think I could do that for an hour. Like, and I would never do it on the other side. I'm not that antagonistic, but like I couldn't sit with somebody doing that to me for an hour. Like I would totally shut down. Like you were saying, you'd get angry. But there are merits to it, right? Which is why his techniques are definitely used in other types of therapy. And then existential therapy specifically focuses on meaning. Really common technique in existential therapy is to have your client write an obituary as if you were to die tomorrow. If you died tomorrow, what would be in there and what would be missing? And what drives you and gives you meaning? It's a very intense like exercise to do. I've done it a couple of times as I was training to be a therapist, really looking at like what gives you meaning and purpose. And it's almost like a way of re-examining your life, right? So all of these together kind of form one approach, very common like therapeutic techniques. And as we have talked about, a lot of people do blend them as well. One more kind of a big model here, the sociocultural model. sometimes called the multicultural model. We're looking here at like multiple people. So the presence of others, right? Like we're looking at like different cultural forces, relationships. From this perspective, we live in a very social world. We're surrounded by people, interacting with people all the time. And so we have to look at how other people shape us, right? How does the media influence us? How do our relationships and family and like all of these different elements around us shape our behavior, right? Let's say every single one of your friends has graduated college, but you haven't yet. Is that impacting you in some way? All of your friends are getting married or settling down and you haven't found someone. Does that like, are you comparing yourself to them? And is that influencing you in some way, right? How does your relationship with your family or your partner shape you? And so from this perspective, we are looking at the role of other people, right? And a lot of like norms and expectations and relationships. And so the treatments from this perspective focus on other people as well. Like most of the treatments in the sociocultural or multicultural like branch involve more than one person. So instead of like the traditional one-on-one therapy, we have things like group therapy and self-help groups and family and couples therapy, which we'll get to on the next slide. But group therapy is something that can be wonderfully helpful for people, right? Some people not a big fan of having to share in front of others, while some people love it, right? The wonderful thing about group therapy is everybody's there dealing with the same issue. And so by getting to hear everybody's stories, you feel like you're not alone. You're not the only one struggling. Sometimes people make friendships and relationships with others in their group this way. It also tends to be quite a bit cheaper because you're sharing a therapist amongst like several people. So group therapy is usually held by like a therapist or maybe multiple therapists versus a self-help group is led by someone who isn't like a clinician, but maybe has more experience. This is stuff like NA or AA, things along those lines where you have someone who isn't necessarily a clinician, but they've been dealing with or have more expertise or experience with an area, right? And again, these can be fantastic. They can also get out of hand very quickly. I don't know if any of you have seen the movie Blades of Glory, where it's like a sex addicts meeting. They're in group therapy for sex addiction and they're all having sex before and after the meeting with each other. Like you oftentimes have to lay down pretty intense boundaries in groups. I have one example of like a self-help group. It's kind of a blending of the two. If you've seen the movie Anger Management, they're all meeting because they're angry and dealing with like anger issues. So this is kind of what this might look like a little bit just for a moment, and like a circle together talking. There's one person leading it, whether that's a therapist or somebody else. People are at different stages of their treatment. So some people are maybe more adept at handling their anger than others, right? They all kind of share their stories and you feel like you're not the only one there. Like you see them all kind of nodding, right? But it can get very heated and out of control very quickly. So boundaries are super important in group settings. But they can be very helpful and they can make therapy more accessible for people as well, like in terms of finances in that sense. Another like couple of things here, family therapy, couples therapy, and then culture sensitive therapies. Family therapy is huge from this perspective, right? And the idea behind family therapy, as painful as family therapy can be, is that we all are like in a family unit together. So if one person is struggling, it affects the unit, right? And if you've grown up in a family or lived with a family at any point, you know that if one person has issues, it spills over onto everybody, right? It affects the whole family unit. So the idea is you bring the whole family in and you work on the family dynamic and communications and elements that are going on rather than just, that one person who's struggling. And family therapy, notoriously unpopular with like the children and teenagers who might potentially be dragged to it. It can feel like a situation where it's like parents ganging up on kids. I grew up in a house that believed in therapy, I think, a little too much, right? I'm pretty sure that at like 6 months old, I was pointing at ink blots and like crying and being like, where, right? And they interpreted it. And so like my family, like my parents just really believed in the merits of therapy. And so we all went. And I remember hating family therapy. Like once a month, we'd all go. And it was like, oh, do we have to? It felt like the therapist and my parents was ganging up on us. But we had one like victory. It was like a huge victory in my mind. We went one day, and my brother and I have two brothers, but one that's very close in age to me. And my brother and I went, and it was my parents complaining that we never cleaned our room, right? They don't clean their room, they don't respect the space, they're not cleaning up their dishes, blah, 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 blah. My brother and I looked at each other like, oh, here we go. The therapist is gonna be like, you have to clean your room, you know, right? And the therapist looked at my parents and said, this is their one space in the world where they can have control over it. And you need to respect that. And my brother and I were like, what? Did we just win? Like, did we just win this battle? You know, and so we go home and like my parents like had no right anymore, according to the therapist, to tell us to clean our rooms or put away our stuff. And we enjoyed that for like 2 or 3 days. And then the fact that like no one was harping on us anymore, we started cleaning our rooms and putting stuff away. We had been mind ninja'd, right? The therapist, you know, they won in the end, but it felt like a victory at the time. But it's often stuff like that, like family dynamics and communication and responsibilities. A very, very common modality within this approach. Same with couples therapy or marital therapy. Now, in California, if you have a master's degree, you're an MFT, a marriage and family therapist. Now, they probably should change that name because it's much broader than that. But couples therapy works with two people who are in a long-term relationship, or it could be more than two. I once worked with a triad of gay men, probably the most interesting therapy I had ever done. It was 3 men in a relationship together who were there for jealousy issues because 2 of them were having sex more than like the other 2, right? And so it was always like, always an issue, right? And they had a lot of jealousy and issues related to that. So fascinating, right? They were like, we have more hands to do everything. And I'm like, that's kind of the problem, right? But it was so interesting. But it's typically 2 people who are in a relationship together. And I think couples therapy of all types of therapy has the most stigma attached to it, right? People who go to couples therapy, it's that like last ditch effort idea, but it can be very, very helpful. Oftentimes couples struggle in the way they communicate with each other. Maybe they have differing sex drives or differing ways of communicating, and those things can cause problems. And you have like a third party mediator who can help you through it. I have a really cool like clip of this. If you've seen the movie Couples Retreat, it's a bunch of couples who are going to couples therapy on this island, and the therapists are all comedians, which I think just in my mind makes it funnier. But it's a bunch of different people talking to therapists about what brought them there. And what's so fascinating about couples therapy is not only do you pay attention to what they say, but you pay a lot of attention to nonverbal stuff. How close do they sit to each other? If you give them a room with a couch and 2 chairs, do they pick the couch and sit together, or do they sit separately, right? Are they holding hands and touching, or are they like at opposite ends, right? Their body language can tell you just as much as the things that they say. So you can kind of pay attention to that as well. But here's a little montage of people going to couples counseling, and then we could talk about it afterward. Meaningful like conclusion or, you know, realization, and it's like, oh, look, we're out of time, like goodbye. That rarely happens, right? Where it all just blends that perfectly timing wise. But I love that they show you so many different approaches, right? You can see different therapists kind of attacking things in a different way, different couples, how like far or close they are to each other and the things that they're sharing. I think it's a really cool little like montage. There's another one in Mr. and Mrs. Smith where it's Brad Pitt and Angelina Jolie doing couples therapy. But really cool like take on what that can look like and what are some of the common issues and so on that bring people in.
What movie or show is that?
Couples retreat. Yeah, I'm gonna say it's like 8 or 10 years old or something like that. But it's good. There's multiple counseling scenes. It's like these groups of couples who go to this retreat on an island, and part of it is like therapy and
It looks simultaneously like at least educational at times, but also fun.
yeah, it's definitely a comedy. Yeah, and I love that he tells him like, it'd make me more comfortable if you didn't take notes. Interesting, let me write that down, right? And then reference my notes later just to throw it back in your face. But couples therapy really helpful, right? Really volatile at times. I have to say that of all the types of therapy that I did, I would look forward to and dread this one simultaneously. Because you just never know what's gonna happen between two people. But two people love each other and they get passionate on either end, whether it's good passion or kind of like more, like toxic levels of passion. It can get heated very quickly, and then you have all these fights break out, and then you basically send them out and like, don't kill each other, I'll see you next week, right? It was always interesting, but it's a very common approach within this framework, and you can definitely, it can be very helpful, and sometimes it's also to help people break up. It's not always to fix a relationship. It might also be to end it like in an amicable way, especially if there are like kids involved, for example. And then this last one up here, culture sensitive therapies, rather than maybe trying to, treat people who are part of marginalized groups. It's like, how can we help you deal with some of the prejudice or discrimination or difficulties that you might be facing because you're a culturally like minority group, right? And that can be very helpful for people as well. So really, in general, there's a lot of different ways that we can look at, what's causing a mental illness, and then therefore how we can treat it. And there's one more that your book talks about that I added in here. They added it in the recent edition. Developmental psychopathology is one other last model. And it's more of like a framework than a model, so I won't write it over there. But it's talking about how everything can collectively come together to create issues, right? And this was a class, I took this class in my master's program, and talking about how, issues that people are facing can either be like very like much along the lines of equifinality or multifinality. And there's these diagrams over here. Multifinality is saying that a number of different developmental routes can lead to the same disorder, right? So you have somebody who experiences trauma, and one person might not have any mental illness from it. Someone else might get PTSD, someone else depression, someone else substance use disorder, or even insomnia. That one issue, a bunch of people could experience the same issue, but have very different outcomes. Versus multifinality is the idea that a bunch of different like traumas or like situations can occur leading to the same outcome, right? So in terms of like PTSD, it could be caused by a lot of different elements. But from this perspective, we often look at like, how does pathology present in different ways across the lifespan? Because sometimes people will have like a cluster of emotional and behavioral issues, but depending on their age and the circumstance in their life, it might present differently. So maybe you have a young person who appears to have depression, and then it appears like it's ADHD, and then it appears like it's something else and something else. It's all the same stuff, but it might manifest differently at different points in your development across your lifespan. So really kind of an interesting take, and we'll come back to this idea a little bit when we talk about personality disorders, how they can very much be kind of like a collection of things building up together to create an issue or a mental illness. In general, though, what we can say is it's probably a combination of all of these models that led to whatever mental illness we're talking about. In psychology, if you ever want to sound brilliant, all you have to say is it was a combination of factors that led to X. You're probably right, right? Rather than saying it was nature, or it was nurture, it was this or that, it was a combination of everything. And 95% of the time or more, you're going to be correct. Because we're complicated as people. So maybe you have some biological factors that are contributing, but you also have some childhood stuff that happened, and some thoughts that aren't helping, and some behaviors that aren't helping. And all of it together is going to explain what's going on with you. And so while we're separating it out, we tend to, in reality, kind of blend it all together. And I have one more little thing to give you that we'll end with today. I'm going to give you your second participation exercise, and this will be a homework assignment. So what I'm going to give you is a little case study that I've modified for this class about a young man named Mark. And so what I want you to do is to read the case study. It's 3 paragraphs. And then on the back, you're going to try and analyze Mark from each of the different theories that we talked about in this chapter, each model. So what I want you to do, and it can be bulleted, that's totally fine. What are some biological things that explain his behavior? Some psychodynamic, behavioral, cognitive, humanistic, existential, cultural. There's definitely a few things for each theory. So what we'll do is I'll have you work on this between now and next class. bring it with you. And then I'll let you get into groups for a few minutes and kind of compare answers, then we'll talk about it together and I'll collect it. If you know you're not gonna be here on Monday, make sure you email it to me, before Monday, so you can still get credit. But let me hand this out, and you're welcome to write directly on here. And again, it can totally be bulleted, it doesn't have to be like full sentences and things. But I think this is gonna be a good opportunity for you to kind of, check yourself on your understanding of the different theories and apply it to Mark. And then after we finish talking about this, we'll move on to chapter 3. Any like questions about this or any last questions or thoughts before we call it a day? Alright. So after you have one, you're welcome to go ahead and go. I hope you all have another wonderful weekend. Hopefully some good football, and I'll see you on Monday. Don't forget to bring this with you on Monday.
No, I only finished, chapters.
Hey, what's up?